In the rain-soaked foothills of North Carolina, nature's drama unfolds near a rushing creek swollen from the storm. Amid the chaos, a circle of crows gathers ominously, their calls echoing with menace around a tiny, defenseless bobcat cub trapped and fighting for its life. Sarah Miller, a dedicated wildlife biologist, stumbles upon the desperate scene, faced with an impossible choice: intervene or let nature take its brutal course. But sometimes the wild reaches out in ways we cannot ignore, begging us to reconsider the delicate line between instinct and compassion. As Sarah steps into the storm, neither she nor the cub knows how deeply this moment will alter their lives. What happens when survival hinges on the kindness of a stranger, and how much courage does it take to find nature itself? This is the story of a fragile life, fierce resilience, and the extraordinary bond forged when the wild meets the heart of humanity. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The air hung heavy with moisture in the small town of Cedar Creek, nestled at the foothills of the Appalachian in western North Carolina. April showers had transformed into a relentless downpour, overnight flooding the streets and turning gentle streams into raging torrent. Sarah Miller, a wildlife biologist and professor at the local community college, peered through the droplets cascading down her windshield as she navigated the water-logged roads on her way home from an emergency faculty meeting at 42. Sarah had dedicated her life to understanding and protecting the region's diverse wildlife. Her modest home sat on the outskirts of town, backing up to a protected forest where she often spent weekends conducting research. Her colleagues sometimes teased her about being more comfortable with animals than people, but Sarah never minded. There was an honesty in animals that humans often lack. The rain had finally begun to lighten, though dark clouds still threatened overhead. Sarah slowed her aged Subaru as she approached the bridge spanning Whispering Creek, now a thundering coffee-colored surge of water carrying debris from upstream. Something caught her eye: movement near the drainage culvert where the roadside gutter emptied into the creek. At first, she thought it was just trash caught in the current, but then she noticed the unmistakable fluttering of black wings. Several crows, at least 5 or 6, had gathered in a noisy, agitated circle, taking turns diving at something trapped against the grate covering the culvert entrance. What on earth? Sarah muttered, pulling her car to the shoulder and flicking on her hazard lights. Grabbing her rain jacket from the passenger seat, she stepped out into the drizzle, squinting against the mist. The crows caught angrily as she approached, reluctantly retreating a few feet, but refusing to abandon their target. As she drew closer, Sarah's heart sank. There, wedged against the grate and barely keeping its head above the rushing water, was a small sodden ball of fur, a bobcat. CB, the tiny creature couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, its characteristic spotted coat plastered against its frail body. One of the bolder crows swooped down, striking at the cub's head with its sharp beak. The little bobcat flinched but made no sound, too exhausted to even cry out. Another crow landed nearby, hopping closer for its chance to attack the defenseless animal. "Hey, get away from there!" Sarah shouted, waving her arms, and rushing forward. The crows scattered, momentarily circling overhead with indignant cries before settling in nearby trees to watch. Sarah knelt by the gutter, heedless of the muddy water soaking through her jeans. The cub was in terrible shape. Its breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Small wounds dotted its face and ears where the crows had landed their vicious pecks. One eye was swollen shut and blood had matted the fur around its right ear. "Oh, you poor little thing," Sarah whispered, her expert eye quickly assessing the damage the bobcat had likely been separated from its mother during the storm washed away by the floodwaters, and stranded in the drainage system, where the opportunist crows had found it. The repeated attacks to its head, combined with the trauma of being swept away, had clearly caused some neurological damage. The uneven pupils and tilted head suggested a serious brain injury. Sarah knew the cub's chances were slim. Wild animals, especially predators like bobcats, rarely survived such trauma. The humane thing might be to let nature take its course, yet something in the way the tiny creature struggled to keep its head above water, refusing to give up despite overwhelming odds. Struck a chord deep within her. Car slowed as it passed the driver leaning out to call. "Everything okay, ma'am?" "Yes, fine," Sarah called back, instinctively shielding the cub from view, just checking something in. The drainage the car drove on several more passed as Sarah deliberated. None stopping. The world continued around them, indifferent to the small drama unfolding by the roadside. "I can't just leave you here," she finally decided, gently scooping up the waterlogged cub. It weighed almost nothing in her hands, a fragile collection of bones and matted fur, trembling with cold and fear. For a moment, one golden eye, the one not swollen shut, fixed on Sarah's face, neither trusting nor accusing, but simply acknowledging her presence in what might be its Finn moments. "I'm going to call you Max," Sarah found herself saying as she cradled the cub inside her jacket. "For warmth, that means greatest, and you're going to need to be the greatest fighter ever to pull through this." The mountain View Veterinary Hospital was nearly 30 minutes away, the only facility in the area with a wildlife specialist on staff. Sarah called ahead on her hands-free system as she drove, explaining the situation to Dr. Ellen Winters, who had collaborated with Sarah on several wildlife research projects in the past. A Bobcat Cub with head trauma. Ellen's voice crackled through the car speakers. "Sarah, you know the prognosis isn't good." "I know," Sarah admitted, glancing at the bundle of towels she'd placed in a box on the passenger seat. She'd cranked the heat despite the mild spring day, trying to warm the cub's dangerously cold body. "But I couldn't leave him there to be pecked to death." Ellen sighed. "Bring him in. We'll do what we can, but prepare yourself. These cases rarely end well." The veterinary hospital was quiet when Sarah arrived the rainy day, having kept most routine appointments away. Dr. Winters met her at the back in trance already, wearing surgical gloves and a grim expression that softened slightly when she saw the protective way Sarah carried the box. "Let's see what we've got," she said, leading the way to an examination room under the bright lights. Max looked even worse than he had by the roadside. The full extent of his injuries became clear as Ellen gently examined him, her experienced hands moving with practiced deficiency. The cub remained unnaturally still throughout the examination, too weak to resist multiple lacerations to the head and neck. Ellen noted severe concussion, possible skull fracture, hypo dehydration. He's also significantly underweight for his age, probably separated from his mother before the storm. Sarah watched anxiously. "Can you help him?" Ellen hesitated. "Normally I'd recommend anesthesia for a full assessment and to clean those wounds properly, but he's too weak. The anesthesia would likely kill him before we could even begin treatment, so we do nothing." Sarah felt a lump forming in her throat. "I didn't say that." Ellen's voice softened. "We'll start with warming him slowly, fluids for the dehydration, and broad-spectrum antibiotics to prevent infection from those wounds. And it's a big if he makes it through the night, we can reassess in the morning. He'll need around-the-clock monitoring." Sarah said, already calculating how to rearrange her schedule. Ellen gave her a knowing look. "You're planning to take him home, aren't you, despite everything I've taught you about not getting attached to wild patients?" Sarah met her gaze steadily. "Someone needs to watch him. Your overnight staff is already stretched thin, and you have experience with wildlife rehabilitation." Ellen conceded, But Sarah, you need to be realistic this. Cub is more likely to die than survive. No matter what we do, I understand, Sarah said quietly, but he deserves a chance 3. Hours later, Sarah carried a small animal carrier out to her. Inside, wrapped in special thermal blankets, Max lay unconscious, but stabilized. His wounds had been cleaned and treated with antibiotic ointment, and Ellen had shown Sarah how to administer subcutaneous fluids and liquid medication. A small arsenal of supplies filled a box in her trunk. Special formula for orphan predator cups feeding, syringes, more medications, and detailed instructions for care. Call me if there's any change, day or night, Ellen had insisted, and Sarah try not to get your hopes up. The rain had stopped by the time Sarah arrived home. The water still dripped from the eaves of her small cabin. Inside, she transformed her rarely used guest room into a makeshift wildlife ICU, setting up a heating pad beneath soft blankets in a large plastic storage container, a temporary enclosure that would keep Max secure while providing enough space for him to move if he regained the strength to do so. Max remained unnaturally still as she transferred him to his new bed, adjusting the heating pad to ensure a gentle, consistent warmth that wouldn't overheat his tiny body. According to Ellen's estimate, he couldn't be more than 5 weeks old, barely weaned in normal circumstances. His golden brown fur, though beginning to dry, still looked patchy and dull against the white fleece blanket. You're safe now, Sarah told him, knowing he couldn't hear or understand her, but needing to make the promise anyway. Just hold on, little fighter. The evening stretched interminably as Sarah monitored Max's condition, checking his breathing every 15 minutes and recording each observation in a notebook. Twice she administered fluids as Ellen had shown her, carefully inserting the tiny needle between his shoulder blades to deliver life-sustaining hydration directly beneath his skin. Each time she held her breath, fearing the slight pain might push his fragile system over the edge. But Max remained stable, not improving, but not declining either. At midnight, Sarah forced herself to eat a sandwich. Though she had no appetite, she'd canceled her morning classes already, sending an email to her department chair explaining the situation. Max wouldn't be left alone, not while his life hung by such a tenuous thread. By 2 in the morning, Sarah's eyes burned with fatigue. She pulled an armchair beside Max's enclosure, promising herself she'd rest for just a moment while keeping watch. Outside, the wind had picked up, whispering through the pine trees surrounding her cabin with a sound like distant waves. She must have dozed, despite her intentions, for when she jerked awake, pale dawnlight was filtered through the window blinds. Panic seized her as she leaned over the container. Had she slept through a crisis? Had Max slipped away while she succumbed to exhaustion? But there he was, his small rib cage still rising and falling, with shallow breaths and something else, something that made Sarah's heart leap. One eye, the less damaged one, was partially open, a sliver of wild gold visible beneath the lid. When Sarah moved her hand slowly above him, the eye tracked the movement, unfocused but responsive. Max, she whispered, hardly daring to hope the cub didn't move, but his breathing seemed slightly stronger than the night before. Cautiously optimistic, Sarah prepared a small amount of the special formula Ellen had provided, drawing it into a syringe without a needle. With exquisite gentleness, she lifted Max's head and placed a tiny drop of the liquid on his tongue. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then his throat worked in a weak swallow. Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. It was the smallest of victories, but a victory nonetheless. Max had made it through the night and was showing the first fragile signs of recovery. She called Ellen immediately. He's responsive, the veterinarian sounded surprised, and he took nutrition. That's unexpected. Honestly, should I bring him in? Sarah asked, reluctant to move him, but willing to do whatever offered the best chance of survival if he's stable. And responding, let's not stress him with transport right now, Ellen decided, Continue the protocol we discussed. Fluids, antibiotics, small feedings every 2 hours. If he'll take them, I'll come by. After my last appointment to check on him, the day passed in a blur of careful feedings, medication, and anxious observation. By late afternoon, Max had consumed almost 15 milliliters of formula, a tiny amount, but significantly more than Ellen had expected him to manage. The swelling around his eye had begun to subside slightly, and while his head still tilted an awkward angle, he seemed more aware of his surroundings. Ellen arrived just after 7, carrying her medical bag and a cautious expression that gave way to surprise when she examined Max's temperature. Is almost normal, she noted, checking the digital thermometer. Hydration improved, neurological response is still concerning, but better than I anticipated, so he has a chance. Sarah tried to keep the desperate hope from her voice. Ellen sighed, removing her stethoscope from her ears. He's still critical, Sarah. The next 48 hours will tell us more, but yes, he has a chance, a better one than I would have given him yesterday. Those 48 hours stretched into today, days and days into weeks. Max's recovery wasn't smooth or straightforward. There were setbacks. A day when he refused to eat, a frightening episode of Caesar-like tremors that had Sarah rushing him to Ellen's clinic in the middle of the night, periods of lethargy that made her fear they were losing ground. But there were triumphs too. The first time Max managed to hold his head steady for more than a few seconds. The morning he actively resisted Sarah's attempts to clean his face with a warm cloth, showing the first flicker of wild defiance that belonged to his nature. The day he pushed himself up on wobbly legs, standing for a brief moment before collapsing back into his bedding. 3 weeks after the rescue, Sarah moved Max from his plastic container to a larger enclosure in her screen porch, a space that offered fresh air and natural light while keeping him secure. His coat had regained its luster, the distinctive spots that marked him as a Bobcat now clear against the tawny background. The wounds on his head had healed, leaving small bare patches that Ellen assured Sarah would eventually fill in with new fur. The neurological damage remained the less severe than initially feared. Max's head still tilted slightly to one side, and his balance remained imperfect. He sometimes misjudged distances when attempting to pounce on the enrichment toy provided, but his golden eyes were bright and alert, tracking every movement with the intense focus of a born predator. He's a miracle case, Ellen admitted during a checkup as they watched Max stalk and attack a feather toy with surprising coordination. I've never seen a wild animal recover from that level of trauma. Sarah smiled, though a familiar worry nagged at her. What happens now? He not releasable, is he? They both knew the answer despite his remarkable recovery. Max's permanent neurological impairments would make survival in the wild impossible. He couldn't be returned to a world where perfect hunting skills and razor-sharp reflexes were the difference between life and death. I've been making some calls, Ellen said carefully. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Asheville might have space. They have excellent permanent enclosures for non-releasable native predators. Education programs, Sarah nodded, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest. She'd known from the start that saying goodbye was inevitable. She wasn't equipped to provide a permanent home for a wild bobcat, even one as special as Max. Her cabin, her lifestyle, the laws governing wildlife, none of it allowed for keeping him, no matter how attached she'd become. When would they take him? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. They can make space next month. He'll need to be a bit stronger first. Anyway, Ellen placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You saved his life, Sarah. Now you need to give him the chance at the best life possible, even if it's not in the wild. The following weeks took on a bittersweet quality as Sarah helped Max grow stronger while preparing herself to let him go. She documented his progress meticulously, both for the rehabilitation center's records and for her own. Memories her phone filled with videos. Max pouncing awkwardly but enthusiastically on a rolling ball Max, figuring out how to climb onto the special platforms she'd built in his enclosure. Max sleeping in a patch of sunlight, his small body curled into a perfect circle on a warm morning in late May, almost exactly a month after the rescue. Sarah sat on the floor of the screen porch watching Max explore a new enrichment puzzle she'd created, a box with holes containing hidden treats that required problem-solving to access. His coordination had improved dramatically, though the slight head tilt remained a permanent reminder of his ordeal. A movement outside caught her attention. A crow had landed on the railing of her open deck, its glossy black feathers iridescent in the morning light. Sarah tined instinctively, remembering the attack that had nearly claimed Max's life, but this was just one bird going about its natural business, not the ominous gathering by the flood-swollen gutter. To her surprise, Max had noticed the crow, too. He froze in, his play body lowering into an instinctive hunting crouch. The crow, separated from the potential predator by the screen, seemed unaware of the danger, casually preening its wing feathers. Max's eyes narrowed, his small body tensing for a moment. Sarah glimpsed the wild creature. He truly was not the dependent patient she'd nursed back to health, but a born predator with ancient instincts encoded in every cell. Despite his injuries, despite his uncertain future, Max carried the untamable essence of his species within him. The crow eventually flew away, unaware of how its presence had transformed the moment. Max remained alert for several minutes afterwards, scanning the deck with the focus of a much older and more experienced hunter. When he finally returned his puzzle box, Sarah felt a strange mix of pride and melancholy wash over her. This was why she needed to let him go, not because she couldn't continue caring for him. She would have rearranged her entire life to do so if that had been the right thing for Max, but because he deserved to fulfill as much of his natural potential as his injuries would allow. The rehabilitation center would provide opportunities she couldn't. Larger spaces, professional care, perhaps even the company of other bobcats who couldn't return to the wild the day of the transfer came too quickly. Sarah had prepared everything meticulously: the special carrier, Max's favorite blanket, detailed records of his medical history and behavioral patterns, even a letter for his future caretakers explaining his preferences and quirks. Ellen arrived early to help with the transfer, bringing a mild sedative to reduce Max's stress during the 2-hour drive to Asheville. Are you sure you don't want me to take him? She offered, watching Sarah's careful preparations. I know how hard this is. Sarah shook her head. I need to see where he's going. I need to know he'll be okay. The Blue Ridge Wildlife Center occupied a sprawling property nestled in the mountains outside Asheville. As Sarah followed the winding driveway, she caught glimpses of naturalistic enclosures housing various native species that, like Max, couldn't survive in the wild but served as ambassadors for conservation education. The director, a silver-haired woman named Margaret with decades of experience in wildlife rehabilitation, greeted them warmly. We've prepared a special quarantine space for young Max, she explained, leading them to a building separate from a main visitor center. Once he's adjusted and cleared medically, we have plans for him to join our junior ambassador program. She showed Sarah the spacious enclosure where Max would eventually live, a thoughtfully designed space with climbing structures, hiding spots, and environmental enrichment that far exceeded what Sarah had been able to provide. 2 other bobcats, both adults, with their own injuries that had rendered them non-releasable, occupied similar enclosures nearby. We'll introduce them gradually when once Max is ready. Margaret explained, many of our rescue bobcats form social bonds despite their naturally solitary nature in the wild. Is one of the adaptations we often see in permanent residence. The actual moment of goodbye was both harder and easier than Sarah had anticipated. Max, drowsy from the sedative barely, registered the transfer to his temporary quarantine space, his familiar blanket. Went with him, carrying the sense of the home he'd known during his recovery. You can visit anytime, Margaret assured her, recognizing the emotion Sarah was trying to contain. Many of our rescuers become regular volunteers. Max won't forget you. On the drive home, Sarah's cabin felt emptier than it had in years. She moved mechanically through the evening, packing away Max's things, cleaning his enclosure, filing away her notes on his care. Ellen had invited her to dinner, concerned about her being alone, but Sarah had declined. She needed this time to process the change. As darkness fell, she found herself sitting on her porch, staring out at the forest beyond her yard. Somewhere in those woods, wild bobcats live there, secret lives unseen and untroubled by human awareness. Max would never be truly one of them again, but he was alive, safe, with a purpose and a future, all because she refused to look away from a small tragedy unfolding in a roadside gutter. A flutter of wings caught her attention. A crow, perhaps the same one from days before. Perhaps another landed on her deck railing, regarding her with a tilted head and bright, intelligent eye. In the fading light, it looked less sinister than contemplative, a wild creature following its own nature. Sarah thought of the crows that had attacked Max, not with now, but with a deeper understanding. They hadn't been malicious, just opportunistic predators themselves, following instincts honed by evolution. The true miracle wasn't that she'd intervened in nature's cycle, but that from that intervention something new and valuable had emerged. Max would now help countless visitors understand and value the wild creatures that shared their world. The crow took flight, a shadow against the darkening sky. Tomorrow, Sarah would call the Wildlife Center to check on Max. Next weekend, she would drive up to visit him, and perhaps when the semester ended, she would take Margaret up on her offer to volunteer. Life would continue, different but meaningful for now. She sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the night sounds of the forest, feeling connected to something larger than herself, the complex, sometimes harsh, but always wondrous web of life that had brought a struggling bobcat cub and a wildlife biologist together on a rainy April afternoon. Max's story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning.